the Toronto Star. I'm Saba Itazaz, and this matters. President Joe Biden tried to balance plummeting approval ratings, pressing domestic concerns, and a relationship with two important allies this week, the Three Amigos, together again, but not necessarily on all things mutual. It's been 5 years since the last U.S.-Canada-Mexico trilateral summit, affectionately or ironically nicknamed the Three Amigos Summit. This week, President Biden hosted the first North American Leaders Summit since 2016. A summit that has been criticized in the past for being more symbolic than substantial is now being seen by many as a pathway to put Canada-U.S. relations back on track after the diplomatic derailment of the Trump years. President Biden campaigned on a promise to have better relations with allies and return things to normal. But normal is looking a lot different since then, with the current president's approval ratings nearly as bad as Trump's, pressing domestic concerns and the American economy taking priority. Observers are now asking whether Biden is even listening to the concerns of allies. The Star's Washington correspondent, Edward Keenan, has been following this, and he joins This Matters to help us understand the impact on the Canada-U.S. relationship as President Biden struggles at home. Hi, Ed. Good to have you on again.
It's so good to be talking to you.
It must have been quite a whirlwind, a couple of days for you, I'm sure. Let's first start with the significance of this visit by PM Trudeau and the Three Amigos Summit, considering how so many in Canada saw President Biden's win as a new hopeful phase in Canada-U.S. relations after what we witnessed in the Trump era.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, this is symbolic of that. This is Trudeau and Biden's first face-to-face visit since the election, although they did have a sort of a virtual summit. They've had several phone calls. They've seen each other at conferences, the COP conference and the G20. But this is the first official visit either of those leaders have paid to each other's country since the election. And it's the first, they call them Three Amigos summits, the first sit down between the leaders of Canada, the United States, and Mexico since 2016. And as you were saying, sort of one of the notable things of the Trump era, they had been having these summits every year or two for about 10 years. And then Trump wasn't interested in hosting them at all. Trump's style of governing was very transactional, less chummy, and much more one-on-one relationships with everybody, right? Everything's a negotiation where you sit across the table directly from your adversary.
Yeah, it was a deal or no deal scenario.
And make demands and whatnot, and less sort of multilateral. And so the existence of the summit itself and the fact that at the end of it, they announced another one for next year in Mexico, it is sort of a returning to normal. And for the Canadian government going into the summit and into their meeting with Biden one-on-one, and meetings they had with other American officials while they were down here, kind of the idea of restoring a relationship that had long existed, that was kind of a partnership in the eyes of Canada anyway, was a big, general overall objective of this meeting, but also of this ongoing relations.
And it's interesting that you mentioned the idea of restoring that relationship. Obviously, we saw the last 4 years were a little thorny in terms of relations among these three countries. Were the relationships damaged to that extent, the U.S.'s relationship with Canada and Mexico, that these restorations and like the tone of this entire summit is restoring and sort of healing and moving on from that?
Everything's complicated, obviously. AMLO, the Mexican president, actually had a pretty good working relationship with Donald Trump. And a lot of people were shocked by that because AMLO's kind of a leftist populist, but they sort of got along in a lot of ways. Trudeau and Trump did not get along at all. So there were major irritants in that relationship having to do with tariffs and whatnot. The renegotiation of NAFTA, which the Americans call USMCA, Canadians sometimes call it that too, although they sometimes call it CUSMA.
It's very confusing. I'll stick to NAFTA.
Yeah, the new NAFTA. Most Canadians, the Canadian people who negotiated, seem to think that it was actually a pretty good deal for Canada. It was an improvement over the old NAFTA in a lot of ways, and it came out sort of winning for everybody. So that was the biggest threat, and it turned out not to be damaging. But there was, my understanding is from talking to lots of different people who are close to these ongoing conversations all the time, but there was kind of a breakdown in general, just like how the two countries coordinate policy and how on a day-to-day basis, an ongoing basis, they kind of work together. And I think that's part of what they're trying to restore here.
Any major highlights or announcements that have come out of this summit?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how major they are, but there was a long list of sort of deliverables or, in the joint statement from Canada, the United States, and Mexico, that include the biggest one was, or the most obvious headline one was an agreement to sort of share vaccines with other less developed countries in the region, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean. The United States had loaned, quote unquote, loaned Canada and Mexico doses of the vaccine earlier. They've now sort of agreed that they're going to pay that forward. They're not paying back the US, but all three countries are going to contribute to other countries in the world that need them. They have other vaccine measures that they're trying to, not just vaccine, but pandemic measures that they've agreed on. There's a supply chain working group that's being set up to try and develop, especially the electric car industry, we'll come back to that. And, using possibly Canada's rare earth minerals, most of which right now come from China. They exist in Canada, but we're not mining them. So, there's talk about a working group to set up how we're going to coordinate that. There was a lot of attention from Americans, especially was paid to migrant issues coming through Mexico at the southern border. There were some agreements on how to work on that in the future. So a list of things. And after all that rambling, the interesting thing is that maybe none of those things deal with what were Canada's top priorities coming down here.
Yeah, I was just going to come down to that. The main themes of the summit for Canada, what were they and where do we stand on those right now?
It was pretty clear. There are a couple recently prominent issues that Canadians feel really threatened by. And one is pipelines, right? And in particular, right now, the case of Line 5 runs through Michigan. The Michigan government is trying to shut it down. It's before the courts. But, Biden has not been a vocal ally on this and still is not. But Trudeau did bring it up in his meeting. But really, from the time they arrived down here, Trudeau brought with him a series of cabinet ministers. He was appearing with the Canadian ambassador a lot. And at every appearance they made over 2 days, which was quite a lot, they were bringing up and prominently pushing their real concern with Buy America policies that Biden has been a proponent of. And in particular, a measure that's right now included in Biden's core economic package that's been pushing through Congress. And it was voted on, very shortly after Trudeau left. The vote was being held overnight. It got there was a talking filibuster. Anyhow, but the point is that it's going to go through the House of Representatives. It still has to go to the Senate. But in there's a subsidy for electric cars only if they're union made and made in America. And the car industry in North America right now is completely integrated. Canada's auto industry, both manufacturing of cars, but also auto parts, depends on sort of things seamlessly crossing the border and all of that stuff being considered North American made. And now these subsidies are meant to build up the car industry. And if, a $12,500 subsidy for cars for Americans who want to buy them is only available on cars that are made in the United States and don't include Canadian content and all of that. What we're talking about there is like them setting up a new supply chain to meet those demands that maybe Canada's frozen out of. And then automakers in Canada and auto parts makers in Canada are concerned that this is building the infrastructure for how we're going to make cars in the future. And we don't want to be frozen out at this early stage. They're not getting a lot of receptive. They've been trying to make that argument. However, Buy America is a popular slogan among many members of Congress who want this included. Biden has been pushing it. When Trudeau first arrived in Washington, Biden went to Michigan to a Hummer plant, electric Hummer plant, to really talk about how, he's creating good American jobs. These are the cars of the future. They're going to be made in America by Americans, for the world. And so, without directly mentioning Canada at all, it doesn't seem like they're really receptive at that point.
We'll be right back. Right. And when we're talking about the optics of this, like you mentioned, it's kind of ironic that even as Prime Minister Trudeau was still in town advocating for a case against this, the U.S. Congress was preparing a final vote on the Buy American policy with implications for Canada. So when we look at all of these sort of symbolic things, would we consider this a successful visit? What are observers saying?
I mean, Trudeau considered it a successful visit. He claimed to consider it a successful visit. And I should say that, like, when he met one-on-one with Biden, his staff say that electric cars was the very first thing he mentioned, that they talked about it. And what he's saying is that on that issue, they're going to continue to advocate. It's going into the Senate. There's a lot of steps between here and there, and that is an ongoing dialogue and all of that. when I talked to a lot of different experts before and after, they said, you don't really measure success of these kinds of meetings by most times by what you announce the day it ends. Unless those things have been agreed to in advance, they're not usually like a major breakthrough like that. But what you're trying to do, and what Canada was particularly looking for here, was a list of things that they're going to continue to work on together, that they're going to follow up on, that, the policy people who work for both countries, who work in the ministries and the secretariats and in the administrations, are going to continue sitting down and hammering things out for the longer term. And I think in that way, it's hard to judge success now because you got to see what the follow-up looks like. But there are several of these sort of agreements that they're going to continue working on things, working groups and whatnot. And in that way, it looks like it might be. But, Perrin Beatty of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce said, no obvious win for Canada here, but success is going to be measured by what happens next. And I think what he's saying there lines up with a lot of what I've heard from a lot of other people, where it's, this is a major milestone in a process, but it's not near the end of the process. It's more like in any relationship, like if you're a salesperson or if you're, building friendships, it's like the party where you meet somebody is one thing, but you're hoping that pays off in the long term. And that's true, particularly on this electric car issue, which Canada is going to continue to try and see if there's a carve out. I mean, Mexico is also concerned about the same provision. And what they both want is sort of, as our NAFTA and trade agreements have sort of long done in the car industry, to sort of recognize North American made cars as domestic for the purposes of these things, right?
Right. And from the reports that I've been reading, these special tax measures for American-made electric cars, it was something that the Canadian media was obviously very interested in and asked a lot about it. And you talk about how White House officials became even more polite than the Canadians in declining your follow-up questions. So they're kind of quiet about this.
So, as I said, for the Canadian delegation, this was the big issue of the week. Right? In the background briefing call and the agendas that the Americans were sending out, this issue was not mentioned at all. For them, it was not even on the agenda. It wasn't even something they were going to talk about. But for the Canadians, it was almost all encompassing. And so when the group of visiting Canadian reporters, paraded into the Oval Office for what's called the photo spray, the little media availability at the top of the bilateral meeting between Trudeau and Biden, you sort of get herded in there and you're all crowded around. Biden and Trudeau make their perfunctory sort of friendly remarks. Biden said there's no easier relationship for an American president than the Canadian one. Then, they get to ask a question. So the first question was on this: is there a chance to carve something out for Canada here? And Biden said simply, we're going to talk about it, next. And so then the Canadian reporters started shouting follow-up questions on that same topic. One of them shouted, why do you want to kill the Canadian car industry, Mr. President? An American reporter did ask a question about the Olympics. It was briefly answered. He said that they were considering a diplomatic boycott, but then more shouted questions about the Canadian car industry. Biden responded a bit more, saying, this is still before Congress. We're going to talk about it, but I don't even know what we're talking about yet because the bill hasn't passed, right? Still more shouted questions, and he answered one more time, basically again to say, it's not time for this right now. And so then as the Canadian press demanded more follow-up questions, Biden's staff just start shouting, thank you, thank you, thank you. And that was a scene replayed lots of different times. So as I was saying, like in Washington, people always joke about how polite Canadians are. It's a constant, everywhere you go, there's a joke about that in every meeting. But boy, when you shout aggressive questions at American politicians, their staff become hyper polite. They're just so full of gratitude all the time, even as the politicians steadfastly refuse to answer the questions.
Interesting reverse trope there. So I also want to talk about President Biden's perception at home, which kind of ties into all of this. His political capital is at an all-time low if you're looking at the polls. And at the same time, he's also looking to fulfill his promise to bring back what he said was normalcy to relationships with allies. But he's also dealing with all of this stuff at home. And many observers say that, there might actually be less of an effort to balance an ally's concerns when clearly there is some domestic priorities to focus on. And those two things don't align. What's your take on that?
Yeah, Biden is not particularly strong politically at home right now. And there are a number of huge domestic issues that he's wrestling with. Some on the positive side, like his own economic agenda working its way through Congress. And in some form, that will be passed and he'll sign it into law in the next, couple months. And that will be, in a way, a big victory for him. But politically, he and his party have been suffering in the polls pretty disastrously. And they got to figure out how to turn that around. In a lot of ways, the economic indicators are great. Unemployment is very low, but inflation is high. And as one writer at The Atlantic put it, there's a kind of a bad vibes. The economic indicators are all great, but people aren't feeling great about the economy. There's all this culture war stuff, the January 6th commission. And then there are, huge international priorities, are considered maybe existential threats, like the relationship with China, but then also, an obsession in the United States with the Mexican border. And Canada, as the easiest relationship, as Biden put it, an American president has, an old loyal friend who's generally well liked. But you get the impression that it's like in either the biblical story of the prodigal son or the one sheep who gets lost or whatever. Being the sort of the loyal ally also means that you're never an emergency that has to be dealt with. It's hard to get to the top of the to-do list. And what I've heard from a lot of people around the White House or people who are being briefed through White House things on this issue is that, like, for example, the electric cars issue is sort of considered by Biden's people. They know it's a Canadian concern, but they consider it kind of a Canadian concern. And their approach is that, Canadians have to understand that Biden has like really pressing domestic politics that he has to wrestle with here. And that sometimes, you're such a good, loyal friend that you can be relied on to
stand by,
to be understanding. I mean, the truth is also, though, and Canadians in their relationships with Americans and everybody else also have domestic politics. And, it's not necessarily popular in Canada when a public infrastructure project is granted to an American contractor, right? Like, we raise a stink about that, too. So I think we can all understand how the politics of that work. But Canada's challenge here, and this is where that longer term relationship comes into play, these ongoing discussions, is that the case needs to be made to Americans that this sort of integrated cross-border free trading supply chains that move back and forth in North America-wide economy that functions as one economy is better for Americans in the long term, is going to create more American jobs, is going to be good for American companies and American workers as well as for Canadians. And certainly in public, they say those things, Canadian officials, at every opportunity. Certainly, almost all the people I know who work full-time on cross-border issues believe it to be the truth. But it's a tough sell because average people who drive, like voters in Michigan or wherever, who drive how politics work at the end of the day, they don't read headlines that way. The idea is not in their minds that sort of creating jobs in Canada is somehow good for them, right? And so Buy America is an easy sell. And I would just say finally, and that this goes back to those relationships, that for instance, Joe Manchin, the senator for West Virginia, who's become famous because he holds the balance of power in the Senate almost as the one Democrat who will constantly stick his finger in the Democrats' pie. He's the deciding vote on a lot of issues. He doesn't like this for his own reasons. There's foreign car manufacturing that's non-union in West Virginia, the state he represents. He's been opposed in some respects to various environmental measures that he thinks would punish the coal industry that's big in West Virginia. A number of reasons, but he's had an open ear to the Canadian ambassador. He's been talking about how he doesn't like this tax credit. He wants to rewrite it in the Senate. There's a good chance that possibly he will. There's other things that will happen as this gets enacted. It's phased in over a period of time. There's a chance that there could be a separate bill that sort of writes in exceptions that have to do with the new supply chains that Canada and the United States and Mexico have agreed to set up. So there are opportunities to fix it down the road. And much of the American companies too, like the big American powerful companies that would be afflicted by this, are also on side with what Canada is saying. And so, maybe as the sausage gets made further down the line and it's not a headline issue, this gets massaged out. And in a lot of ways, that's Canada's bigger hope, not just on this issue, but a lot of issues that they're working with governors and members of Congress and members of the administration to sort of quietly make sure that whatever the populist politics of the day that are going to make things work, that as these things get implemented, the wrinkles come out and we wind up with the kind of relationship that we've grown used to, where we are, as they all say when they shake hands at the meetings, like best of friends, oldest friends, partners in the world. It hasn't always felt like that recently, and it's too soon, I think, to tell if we're getting back to that. But that was certainly the hope for this whole week in Washington for the Prime Minister and his delegation.
Thank you so much for your time and insight. I learned a lot, as always, Ed.
Thank you. It's been fun to talk about.
I was speaking to the Star's Washington correspondent, Edward Keenan. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Sabai Tazaz. The This Matters team is Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bucknick, Raju Muther, and Sean Pattington. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattington. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.